all across the Western Hemisphere, in the Appalachians, the Tetons, Southern California, and places beyond that as well. And Ellen, I would say, is really does really challenging field experiments. I think that's what she's most known for, and has built an enormous wealth of data about how hormones coordinate bird behavior and how birds can be flexible and responsive to environmental change. And that doesn't even begin to do justice to what she's done. Very famous neuroendocrinologist as well. The last thing I would say is she is also quite well known. She has mentored many, many students onto very distinguished and successful careers herself. So she is first lab, and she herself is the progenitor of many, many scientists that are across the United States and across the world. And just for us science geeks in the audience here, I couldn't help but get onto the Google Scholar. So Ellen has over 15,300 citations today. They seem to go up like 100 a day. Yes, she is obviously quite a well-respected, well-cited scientist. And so tonight, without further ado, Ellen will be talking about 3 billion missing birds. Where have they gone, and what can we do? So Ellen, thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. That was very sweet. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I'm really, really pleased to be here. It's so beautiful. Blown away by the azaleas and the rhododendrons and the lilacs and the scent in the air and the sun in the sky, and it's gorgeous. So, and I've met interesting people, students, faculty, birds I haven't seen in a long time. Lazuli bunting, thank you, Carl. That was wonderful. So it's been a really, really, really nice 2 days. Sue picked me up at the airport. We had food at Jamie's house. And again, thank you for that very nice introduction. So I really am honored to have this opportunity to speak in honor of Doc Storm. So of course I didn't know him, but I looked him up and read a piece in the journal Copia, which is a herpetological journal. And in that I learned about the 70 graduate students that he had mentored, like 20, 70, just saying. And each one, if you've ever advised graduate students, you know each one is a challenge. You want each one to succeed, but they're different from one another. So I can't even imagine what 70 must have been like for him. But one of his former students, whom I don't know, funded this award and opportunity and the good food that we just had. And another one, Edmund Brody Jr. at Utah State University, a now retired herpetologist, wrote a piece in Copia about Doc Storm and all of the students and what it meant to him. And I've met Edmund Brody Jr., but only briefly. But his son, Edmund Brody III, was a colleague of mine at Indiana University. So I knew Butch well, and now is the director of Mountain Lake Biological Station, where I've worked in the Appalachian Mountains. A little bit more about that in a few minutes, for over 30 years. Now, Butch hasn't been there the whole 30 years, but he runs the place now. And so that gives me a sort of remote sense of connection with Doc Storm and the person whose honor we're here for tonight. So I'm an ecologist, and I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I'm an animal behaviorist, which is another way of saying I do my best to be an integrative biologist. And I've enjoyed the opportunity to learn in all those areas. And I've done it mostly by studying this one bird. People try to give me credit and they say, well, she studied other things too. Not really. Okay, one bird. But a lot of aspects to that one bird. And that's where the ecology, the animal behavior, and the other aspects of everything good about biology comes into account. So I love birds. I love birds the way Doc Storm probably loved herps. But the thing about loving something, as you know, is you're vulnerable. Because once you love something, and you're fearful that it will be lost, you're less secure in your love and in what you can count on in the future for this thing that you've allowed yourself to fall in love with, which in my case and what we're talking about here is birds. And birds are in trouble. Birds are not the only kind of organism that is in trouble, or the habitat or the whatever, but they're in trouble. And only we can, make a difference. I mean, if we don't reverse our ways of living on the planet, there will continue to be fewer birds. So I'm here in honor of Doc Storm and in honor of birds. So to prepare, really, I asked myself, well, why do I love birds? And part of it is early exposure. So my brother, and I will show you this slide of my brother. This is he now in his mid 80s, but at the time I want to tell you about the early exposure, he was like 15 and I was like 4. And I couldn't read yet, but he was doing a Boy Scout thing on birds and learning their names. And so he thought it'd be a good idea if I learned the names of the birds too. And I don't really have much recollection of that. That's kind of a family story. You could name birds before you could read. I have this vague notion of a relative that visited. And I didn't really know the relative, but when you're little, you climb in anybody's lap. And actually, this is not me, to tell you the truth. I looked this up on the internet, but I want to convey the idea that when I was just a bit of a thing, and my brother was teaching me the names of birds, but recollection I do have is of sitting close to a relative that I didn't know, and some kind of bird that I must have been identifying. Then it was red. And I even think it might have been a summer tanager. So that's what I'm showing you here. And again, it's a cheat because it isn't really a picture of me and I don't know this person. But and then really nothing more about birds. So 4 or 5. And then I started to grow up and my brother went to college with the 11 years older than that he was. And yeah, I didn't get to college yet. I was on a swim team, no birds. And I really wanted to be popular. So I was a cheerleader. So embarrassing. But again, no birds. All right. And I then went to college and I studied botany. And I like plants. I like plants very much, but I didn't really like botany at that time. So now I love plants all the more. But I was kind of bumbling around about thinking I wanted to be an academic. My sister had married a college professor. And that's what women did if they wanted to be academics in that time. You would marry a college professor. So I thought maybe I would marry a college professor. And then somewhere along in there, I thought, I want to be a college professor. But I didn't know what to study. So I actually wanted to be a college professor before I knew what it was I wanted to study. I was working in a photosynthesis lab, grinding up spinach and looking for my next step. So while I was lab tech, I read a couple books, and people of a certain age, I see Bob nodding, may have read these books as well and found them formative. So one of them is King Solomon's Ring, and that's really a series of short vignettes written by Konrad Lorenz, who later became a Nobel Prize winner when ethology was recognized as a discipline. And another one I read was by Nico Tinbergen, A Herring Gull's World. And again, I found that one just fascinating. So there was something about birds and behavior and nature, and really all along kind of nature nurture. How did animals know how to do what they knew? Did they learn it? Did they come programmed that way? Always a degree of fascination. I have a lot of psych colleagues who go, Ellen, nature nurture is a dichotomy that you cannot employ in your thinking. And then I'll talk to my quantitative genetic friends and they'll go, oh yeah, we need to factor out the environment so we can find out what really is getting inherited. So all of those things early along, I have always been interested in how we vary and how we behave and what are the causes, the multiple causes of that. So I decided I was going to be a behavioral biologist, and as it turns out, the husband that Bob mentioned, Val Nolan, studied birds at that point. So I studied with Val. And Val and I did research together for decades, but we also enjoyed looking at birds. He was a much better bird identifier than I was, but we would enjoy birds in the morning and in the evening. We'd sit out on our deck and notice that the chimney swifts would fly over in the autumn, or the chimney swifts would fly all summer long. I'm getting confused about my birds here. The chimney swifts would fly over the sky. They were really numerous. And then, they weren't so numerous. And then they were a little less numerous even after that. And fairly recently, I was doing a project with a student who wanted to write a proposal to get a chimney built at a local children's science museum. And I said, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. The chimneys aren't very abundant anymore either. And I said, there used to be a lot more chimney swifts than there are now. And she looked at me with skepticism. Okay. She thought she knew how many chimney swifts were in the sky. She didn't see any variation from anything that she had yet experienced. She was still a young scientist, but I knew from experience that there were fewer chimney swifts than there used to be. And other things that were fewer, we used to drive to the airport and we would see kestrels along the way, and we would guess before we got to the airport. It took about an hour to get from Bloomington to Indianapolis. And we would guess numbers like 8 or 10, kind of like the license plate game, only it's how many species will you see or how many individuals will you see of different species. And I drive to the airport now and there are no kestrels. I've seen kestrels here, so it's wonderful. But in my part of the world, when kestrels used to be sufficiently abundant, we could guess numbers like 8 or 10. I don't see any more when I go. And the nighthawks, similarly in the lower right-hand corner, would fly over our deck, and they would mark the seasons as opposed to the coffee in the morning and the beer at the end of the day. And again, we were seeing many fewer chimney swifts and nighthawks and kestrels. So there's a name for this, and the name of this difference between age groups in how much they think biodiversity has declined has a name, and it's called this shifting balance syndrome. So this was a study, it was done in the UK, and we have bars here corresponding to my right, your left, young people 0 to 30 years of age, or people 60 and over, and everything in between. And this was a survey study, so the respondents were asked, well, of 3 common birds, everybody recognized that they were common birds, how many do you think have declined in the last 20 years? And if you were 0 to 30 years old, and it really couldn't have been 0, so, let's at least have the respondents old enough to have an experience to report. They would think there had only been 1 of the 3 most common birds that had declined in abundance recently. Whereas if you ask the older respondents, then most would say at least 2, and some would say 3. So like 60% and 40%. And that's a way of looking in a data kind of way at the fact that the older you are, the greater sense you have and the greater ability you have to appreciate how biodiversity may have declined in your time. And then, pardon me, but then the older generation isn't here anymore. So they aren't here to report and convey how things used to be. And so the baseline shifts, not the same sense of what we've lost over time. Now that's personal experience, and most of us find it more persuasive to see data other than what are people thinking about what happened to biodiversity. So if I can do this successfully, in 2018, a series of authors put out a paper, and they put it in Science magazine, and Science is, at least in North America, the premier journal. If you can get your paper in Science, everybody will know what you learned that gives a darn about science, and it's not easy. So they had to really go through several revisions in order to meet the standard, but what they wanted to report was what's happened to avian biodiversity over the past 50 years. So this little video, if I can do it, will convey part of what they saw. And if you've already seen this, then the birds are nice. And so I hope you won't mind seeing it again. So I'll try not to yell Teresa right away. Let's see. Pretty meadowlarks there for sure. That's your state bird? Honestly, Western meadow. Yeah, okay. Eastern meadowlarks in severe decline, really. And I guess, well, as we see here more with a little bit more data, but that's a beautiful bird, isn't it? It's a lovely song. And I've learned about myself that whatever bird is on the screen, I go, oh, I love that bird. And then the next bird, and I feel exactly the same way. So. Okay, so what is the message there that's being conveyed by the study? I'm going to show you like a couple of graphs in a second, but basically what I'm going to show you with these graphs is that over the past 50 years, we've lost 3 billion birds, going by 8 billion to 5 billion, and no necessary end in sight. And it was a galvanizing thing for me, like, but you know, with the professional time that I had remaining, I was galvanized that whatever I could do, whatever small contributions I could make, whatever I could encourage other people to do, and maybe we can do it together, was going to have to do with trying to undo, reverse, stop the decline in birds if we could. Okay, let's look at a little graph here then of the results of the same paper that I'm talking about that appeared in Science in 2018. So there's a number of panels here. And if we start with the one on the left, what's being conveyed there is, well, let me get a little closer so I can be sure, change in abundance of birds, all birds, in billions of birds, okay, going from what the starting point was in 1970, and then following the decline over that period of time, pushing about 3 billion years. So 1970, I didn't quite have a PhD yet. I had made a commitment to birds. I wanted to care and learn about what I could. And then, you know, 50 years go by and I'm 70 now, you know. In those 50 years, this was happening. And I was like, I knew about the chimney swifts. I knew about the, you know, I knew about the kestrels, but I didn't have numbers. I didn't have like, wow, you know, this is real and this is disturbing. And again, while it seems to be leveling off a tiny bit, what we know is that these losses are continuing. And if we, again, don't act in some way or another, going to be many, many fewer birds. And then they broke down the data so that we could understand it in different ways. So the middle here is doing the change in millions of birds because it's broken down by habitat. So were all habitats equally losing birds, or were some harder hit than others? And this lower here, I actually have one of these thingies, is, oh, wrong. Never mind. This lower brown here, that's grassland birds. And that's largely agriculture. So, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's see. No, wrong way. Sorry, let me catch up. There. Okay, thank you. So the brown being the loss in millions of birds that are grassland birds. which includes the meadowlarks, which includes your state bird, which I've just learned. The top blue line, that's the waterfowl. So the video quickly showed us that at least one habitat was not losing birds. And I think, we can put that down partly to duck hunters. So, people that we might have thought were in opposition when it came to saving birds, wrong. We need to be thinking together about ways to reverse the losses. And then in intermediate habitats, our western forests are here. So you all have not been spared. And the boreal forest where my juncos live is like about in here. So you can all see it. You can see that over time, the same 50 years, that was the 50 years that I was busy being a biologist, we were seeing rapid declines in bird diversity, bird abundance, also to a certain extent, diversity. Okay, now the paper didn't really focus specifically on causes. And I need to tell you how they knew too. So while you're looking at the list, a lot of people like birds. Maybe you do it in this room. They do conduct things called breeding bird surveys in the spring. And so all over North America, individuals who know their birds are out in, say, a week in June, and they move along, usually in their cars, and there's a protocol and everybody's following exactly the same protocol. And you get to a spot and you get out of your car and you listen. So you need to be a good birder to do this. And you can't be too old a birder to do this, or you may be not hearing things that you need to hear. So, this is for people with full range of their senses getting out and the full knowledge of being able to recognize a bird by its sound and also by vision. Back in the car, drive another distance, listen again, back in the car, drive another distance. Everybody does that more or less at the same time, and they turn those data in to a national agency that's keeping track. And that's what made possible to look at what those numbers had done over that period of 50 years. I think that's just amazing. And then the video showed us a little bit that there was some radar as well. And so it was possible to get a sense of what the change in biomass was that was passing over North America during migration seasons. That's turned into birdcast now, and I'm told there's birders in the audience and stuff. You're one of those people that goes online to see whether this is a night of really heavy migration. They're using all that radar in higher density and greater ability to resolve what kinds of organisms there are. And, they're declining. So why? Well, in general, I mentioned agriculture really quickly. Places where birds used to live have been converted into something else. And I also know that there are conservation biologists here in Fish and Wildlife, and people are maybe here. So these are familiar concerns. And it's not just habitat loss, but that's a really big one. Various kinds of pesticides, running into buildings, so window strikes, cats, those take out a lot of birds. And then when people are harvesting or using birds as something to eat, or other kinds of biodiversity as something to eat, those are all causes. I want to take a little closer look at the causes, because that's like just some black and white text on a screen. And this study just came out in 2022. So I was talking 2018 up until now. Now this is the latest effort by a series of Lees et al. Biologists to figure out where we're losing birds. This is about bird species. So on the y-axis here is numbers of species, up here from 0 to 2,250. And there's roughly 10 to 11,000 birds of altogether. So if we're looking at the impact of resource use on species of birds, then there's like 2,200 birds being affected by that. And if we're looking at the impact of agriculture on the number of birds, then that's over 2,000, and that's 2,000 of the 11,000. So it's just to get a sense of scale, various causes on why we're losing birds, and some sense of how many birds are being impacted by these various threats to biodiversity. Pollution, residential and commercial development. That's partly land conversion, but it's also that those areas can provide threats to birds. And this latest paper from 2022 also broke things down so that the biological resource use, which is not like a very catchy idea about where birds are being lost, logging, hunting and trapping, fishing, terrestrial plants, or with agriculture, crops, livestock, plantations, aquaculture. So and like counting birds, the same thing about coming up with the causes. If you're going to try to reverse something, you have to know how bad it is and what what are the causes that would need to be addressed if you're going to try to change things. So, sorry, graphic images of the way birds are lost. Window strikes at World Trade Center and a meal of birds from sticky traps in the Italian Alps. So I won't make you look at that too long. Yeah. So this why should we care thing, I'm going to kind of think that we're here together and we're converted. So you probably don't need to be asking yourself why you should care, because I suspect that just as I love birds, you already care. But there's a couple of ways to try to convince other people about why it might matter. And one is the economic view. It's the capitalist approach. Explain it to people in terms of how it's going to affect their pocketbook. And then you say things like the video did, which is birds are pollinating, they're spreading bird seeds, not bird seeds, but seeds that for plants that we care about, and then calling that ecological services, or acting as pollinators, acting as seed dispersers, or generating income. So that in terms of ecotourism, if the birds are an attractive source for bringing people to come to a particular area to stay in your B&B, Airbnb, then that's an economic view of why you should care. And then, I'm calling this the Indigenous view, and I don't want to be offensive to anybody. What I'm trying to convey is that it isn't always in terms of dollars and cents why things matter. And so clearly, an Indigenous view might be a different view of how we relate to the natural world, and not us as dominating, but us as relating and needing and interacting. So a more inclusive and holistic view. And to me, that's why we should care. So I didn't know if I'd have young people or older people in the audience, but it doesn't really work, I think, to just say it's so desperate, it's so awful, I'm just going to go bury my head. I'm reading about young people who aren't in the current time thinking about retirement or saving any money because the world's going to hell in a handbasket. And so I'm at least going to live as brightly as I can, sort of a war attitude, really. So that's happening, I think. And that's not going to get us anywhere. So I think, at least for me, they do say to me, how are you going to get up in the morning? And it's just not a problem, okay, about getting up in the morning, because I think that we can slow the rate of losses. And I think that we can protect biodiversity. And I think we can change attitudes. And I think with some people, it'll be an economic point of view. And for other people, it'll be a sense of belonging and living in the world and wanting it to be a world that's including other kinds of life. But the Junco has given me a certain set of observations that I told some of you about yesterday, which is that if we give them enough time, they might be able to keep up. And if Juncos are representative, then other species as well may be able to keep up. And so what have we learned about Juncos that gives us reason to think that maybe we could be hopeful? And that's what I'd like to do with some of the time that remains. Oh, yeah, here's a Junco. And there. Pretty, huh? And here's a pretty picture of a junco. Why, when you get up close and personal, you can see that this is the most beautiful bird. Really not a problem. You just need to be up close and personal. And then here's a couple of slides that I showed yesterday. So if you were there, forgive me, but this is the junco in the forest in the early spring, and this is a male, and he's establishing a territory here. He's a ground feeding, ground living bird, as juncos are in general. Well, he sings a song. It's a long range song, and that really wasn't loud enough. So come back tomorrow night and we'll do it again. That song will attract a female. The male switches to courting the female intensely. He changes his posture, he puffs up, makes another kind of song, which is really not audible. And then attempts to court a second female at the risk of losing his first female to another male. And then that's the dynamics of the social system of the junco in the spring. So males competing with one another, females making choices. And then what happens next? Well, they build a nest and the female lays the eggs. She incubates, they both tend the young, males and females feeding. Lots of predation in the woods, so many of those early nesting attempts are lost, but they'll try again. So 2 broods efforts, almost all the birds in the forest will try to do that. If you actually look at the real reproductive success, most of the success in every generation is coming from a few individuals, and there are lots of losers that don't leave any offspring at all, despite giving it their best. Yeah, one more little video. You know, I must have thought I was going to talk to you for 2 hours because I have so many more things I'd like to tell you, but he's on the outside, she's on the inside. He's picking up a little bit of grass, which is nesting material. He doesn't build the nest. So like, what's that about? You do think maybe it's invoking a behavior on the part of the female. And these little you're hearing, yeah. So that's what it looks like in the forest at the beginning of this season. And I'm going to skip this. Juncos they live a lot of different places and they look different from place to place. And tell you a little bit of a few things I've learned about juncos that suggest that they can keep up if they're given enough time. This is a crappy old slide from a graduate student that left it behind, and we haven't yet gotten the paper published, but the essence of the information is here. So this is in the winter. And juncos live in the boreal forest. They live in Canada, and then they migrate south for the winter. Studied them in the eastern US. This was my thesis work back in the day, and found that using Christmas bird count data, which is similar to the breeding bird survey data, again, it's citizen sciences going out, doing things in a protocol way, reporting their information, and then it's possible to go to the database and say, as a function of latitude, north to south, how many juncos did the people see on the Christmas bird counts? And what you see here is more or less a normal distribution. So there's a place beyond the edge of the range where you don't find juncos in winter. And again, too far south, you don't find any juncos in winter. But in between, there's this more or less bell-shaped curve, and they're most abundant at the middle latitudes. The message of this slide is that the dashed lines are the traditional locations for where birds are in the winter. And the current line, the solid line, is where they are now. And the star indicates for a given latitude, has the abundance changed? And everywhere there's a star, there's been a change. And what you see is that the birds are moving north. Or said another way, not exactly moving north, they're not migrating as far. So when you're closer to the breeding range, they're more abundant. Juncos are more abundant than they used to be. So in general, based on these data, with the birds found more abundantly in the north, the implication is that they're making shorter migrations. And for my thesis, I studied differential migration, which is that females, I was able to demonstrate, are making longer migrations than males. And hence within this, more or less, the females clustered there, and the males are more or less clustered there. But my student, Dawn O'Neill, who now works for the Audubon Society, hugely successful, did some comparisons of years when we looked at the sex ratio, the proportion of females in the population. So in Indiana, where I live, there were a lower proportion of females in the late 1979, 80 than there were in 2008, 2005. So it's not just that the abundance has moved north, but that females are in fact making shorter migrations, and so they're more abundant at higher latitudes than they used to be. I spent years trying to figure out why it was that females made longer migrations than males. But for tonight, the message is the climate's changing, the migratory behavior is changing, and to the extent that we could demonstrate that, and we can't, it seems to be favoring a change in the distance migrated by birds from the wintering range. I got a couple more of these to show you. And this is what's happening to the lay date of females that live in the forest. So the male's courting them, and then the female builds the nest, and then she lays the egg. When is she laying it? How early in the year, as a function of all the years that we've been studying them in Virginia, where we started in 1983 and we're still doing it. And you're out in the forest and you look for that first nest for each female and you ask what the date was. And when we say that the date is later, that means higher numbers. That means that it took them longer before they laid the first egg in the spring. And then as the numbers fall, what that's saying is that the females in the more recent years are laying their eggs sooner. So weather's getting warmer, they're responding to that. In fact, they actually are responding strongly to the April temperature. So as April is warmer, females lay sooner. As April is cooler, females back in the day would lay later. Just another thing. So the distance migrated and when you start breeding are responding to environmental change. And one more little set of things that we've observed, not just the timing or the distance of the migration, but actually living places where juncos didn't used to live. So juncos were birds of the forest. They were rural, very much so. But about 30 years ago, they started occupying the city of San Diego. And they hadn't been there before, so they used to be there in the winter, and then they migrated away for the spring. Well, they settled in and became resident juncos in San Diego. And importantly, changed their behavior in ways that seem better suited for a city life. So in the city, it's noisy, okay? And so Dustin Reichert was a student of mine, and he would be studying by taking tape recorded sound files. I should not say tape, that's very dating myself. They would make records of the birds' vocalizations. And what Dustin found was, if I can make a sound, and I'm aware that I'm been here a long time, so I want to hurry through. This is what a junco sounds like. And what he did was compare the quality of the song produced in a city as opposed to produced in a nearby mountain range. And the sounds that are of the city are loud, lower amplitude, high amplitude, lower frequency sounds of the roar of the bus and the roar of this and the roar of that. And if a bird sings at a slightly higher frequency, the odds are that it will be heard over the sounds of the city. And in just that period of time, it was true, I'm looking at different syllables here, that the birds in the city were singing at a higher pitch, at a higher frequency than the birds in the nearby mountain. And we then brought them back to Bloomington and recorded their songs living in Bloomington, and the difference was maintained. So it doesn't mean it's genetic, but it does mean that at least in terms of early experience, they were modifying their vocal behavior in relation to the external sounds. And I was going to show you a video, but I have been talking too long. One more thing. This is a hormone It's the hormone corticosterone. It's a measure of how animals respond to stressors. When you handle them or take a blood sample, their level of corticosterone goes up. And it's kind of a fight or flight sort of a thing. And this is comparing the mountain birds with the city birds. The city is the red line. Catch the bird, take a blood sample, wait 10 minutes, 15 minutes, take another blood sample, corticosterone goes up. They're distressed. Wait another period of time, 30 minutes, the corticosterone goes up again. But note, please, if you live in a city, you are not as stressed as this bleeding and handling than if you're from a more rural environment. So another adjustment to city life that suggests that given enough time, birds will move into a new habitat, they'll adjust the way they proceed through their lives, and that will be potentially resistance to the kinds of losses that we've described so far. So here's a summary. Juncos are responding to environmental change. They're adjusting their migratory behavior. They're adapting to warmer springs. They're adjusting to urban environments, providing reasons to be hopeful, save your money. And what they need from us is the gift of time. So I could go on, but I'm not gonna. I'm gonna give you time to ask me any questions you might like to. And I really appreciate the attention that you've given me. And it's a pleasure to be here. And let's hear it for Doc Storm.
Questions for Ellen?
Hello.
So what do you do if you don't live in the city, but you sort of live in a rural area?
What would I do about juncos or what I?
Just birds in general.
Oh, okay.
And juncos. We have a lot of juncos.
Do you? Okay. Well, keep your cats in. The answer was keep your cats in, was only one
We
answer.
don't have any cats.
Okay, well, good. You're not contributing to
We
the,
have neighbors that have cats, but we
Okay.
don't have cats.
how are your windows? Are you got birds
Yeah,
running?
we do get a couple of hits.
Yeah. And I think that couple of hits, I understand, I live in the world too, but everybody's couple of hits, serious, serious problem. So the stickers, I think they help. Where you put your feeder in relation to the windows and how, whether they've gotten up rapid flight acceleration right into the window or whether it's sort of close enough by that they don't have a chance to accelerate before they hit the window. Little things. I think these things make a difference because one thing is if you're doing something that you're hoping will have lesser impact if you're living where you live, you're much more likely to do other things like talk to your neighbors, engage with people who don't care, have a little conversation with them about what they might do too. And that's the magic, I think, that one, you can see fewer birds harmed, but two, you can be part of the movement to say, if we're thinking, being mindful about the way we're living in the world, we can at least reduce our impact. I'm sorry, hi. Right, I think even though in my state, they're not protecting wetlands, there is a political force to protect woodlands. And people in the room may know the answer to this better than I do, but that's my understanding. And so if you've got the habitat for the ducks, then the ducks are there. And if you're using management techniques like growing corn in the summer and then flooding in the winter, and then the birds come and they can eat the remnants of the corn, that kind of management, which is something that agencies do care about, has shown a benefit in waterfowl, but for so many other birds, they're not of special concern. They're not of concern to agencies, and so there's not specific things that being done. But I'm really cognizant of that. There are people in the room who know more about that. I know about juncos. Yes.
So you mentioned that songs have been changed and being more urbanized. Are there other examples of various behavioral pieces they've adopted in the last few years?
In other species, are you asking whether this is? Well, okay, so think the answer is yes and yes. So if we're talking about other species, then others are showing, people worry, there's this phrase ecological trap, okay? And people worry that the initial steps in choosing to live in a particular place, the city might provide that kind of thing. So the queue is there and then you move in and then you get there and a little bit later in the sequence, the insects aren't there to feed your young. And so you've been lured in by only a portion of the things that make a place suitable. That's an ecological trap. That can happen too. Black red starts in Germany. But there are other examples like the junco that cities are bringing in new occupants and they are adjusting their behavior, their timing, their what they eat. So for me, it's an example of things that are changing where the animal is making a positive response. But there is that other ecological trap worry. Yeah. Yes.
Related to that, why San Diego, and is there any evidence of resident populations becoming established in other southern cities?
Yes, I love he asked that question. So why San Diego and is it happening anywhere else too? And I should have been repeating the questions all along, so forgive me. So San Diego was first. It was only about 30 years ago. UCLA next. So I had a student who was studying juncos moving into Los Angeles. And then you go, what, 2 campuses? That's pretty weird, you know. There are juncos expanding, partially urban, partially just more area in northeastern Ohio. So again, this is not your part of the world, but juncos don't breed in Ohio. They breed farther north up into Canada, but they are in fact showing up there. And we've done some genetic studies to see, well, are they coming from the Appalachians? You know, are they moving west into Ohio? Or are they individuals that formerly migrated and then have settled down, which is what we think happened in San Diego. And to the best of our knowledge now, based on genetic structure kinds of things, they seem to be migrants that have moved into Ohio and aren't migrating any longer. But there's much more to learn about that story. So, yeah. Yes.
What about feeding the birds? Should we feed them year round, the winter only, so they don't lose, their own ability to?
Yes. So might you, again, in an ecological trap kind of way, make an attractive thing. And then if you don't follow through on that attractive thing and they have in fact slowed out the distance that they might have gone. I think it's a concern, but I think a lot of migratory behavior and migration distance is using the word programmed, but built in to I'm trying to avoid genetics words. But in any case, whoa, so sorry. In any case, established. So I think if you start feeding, you should keep feeding. And then the other thing that's happening lately that you're probably aware of, which is various kinds of diseases, that are showing up. And then agencies are asking us not to feed anymore. And so I have been paying attention to that lately and not feeding. But it didn't involve a quitting after something I'd already started. It just, we all turned it off. In the Eastern US, this didn't really happen yet. And we had this kind of wasting disease that, not as in deer, but that was happening to a lot of birds. And nobody knew why. And some people thought it was the cicadas because we had a 17-year cicada outbreak last year. And other people saying, well, it wasn't, but it certainly went away when the cicadas went away. So we don't really know what that was about. But now avian flu, and we're being warned to be very cautious about feeders because even though the songbirds don't get the avian flu, they may be eaten by something that is susceptible. And so avoiding or minimizing the spread of avian flu in birds that come at bird feeders is something that we're being encouraged not to do by not feeding. Yes?
Okay, I have kind of 2 questions. My first question is when we speak to the general public, I think that 3 billion initially sounds like a really big number, but nowadays, because we do have so much technology that has a crazy scale that's incomprehensible, how can we engage the general public to truly understand what 3 billion individuals means?
Yeah.
So that's my first question.
Okay.
And my second question.
You expect me to remember the first one? Why do the second?
The second question is that the juncos have have urban lands and then farmlands, but we have less forest lands. So what can we expect maybe in the flexibility of species or even just the diversity of species in the long run?
Okay, I'm going to take the second one first. And I think we still may like run out of juncos. So mindful, please, that when I made the segue, we were talking about threats, we were talking about losses, and then I was saying save for the future, that I think it's better to have hope than to not. And that when there is evidence to suggest that adaptation is going on, that birds are responding in an effective way to environmental change, we should be aware of that. But I don't think that means that everybody's just fine, because they're not just fine, because we lost the 3 billion and the numbers are still declining. So I think that returns us to the first question of how to have a sense of what 3 billion is. Yeah, so I mean, you can say things like 1 in 4. That has a bigger impact on me than 3 billion, because unless I have the 3 billion in context, which is that there were 8 and now there's 5 and it's going down. So by itself, an ungrounded number, I think people are spending that to go to the moon or at least get out of the local gravitational field. So yeah, 1 billion by itself, make it a trillion, make it a quadrillion if you're going to make it anybody's significant. So I get your point, I think. But then this is not really continuing with the question. I've given the answer, the best answer I have, which is 8 going to 5 and 1 and 3 or 4. Oh my God, I lost my thought. Give me a chance. It's gone. It's gone. It may come. Oh yeah, I got it. Okay. A point I think we need to make when we're talking about these things, because these unattached numbers don't have a lot of meaning. How many millions were killed in window strikes and how many whatever, is that every year birds die and every year birds are born. And what we're looking at is a change in the losses of productivity and survival. So, birds die every year and always have, but for all the birds that are being produced each year, more are being lost, produced, more being lost. And it's the net loss that's so, and that I think we can also grasp. We can see that mortality is greater than productivity, and it's truer of some habitats than it is true of others. And that's why the abundance is going down. So is that helpful? Okay, great. Yes.
Studies that would indicate there's some sort of speciation going on with birds as kind of a response to the changes that are going on.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I'm going to come to yours next. Okay. So the question is some of this response to environmental change likely to be, well, you tell me if I've got your question right, likely to result in the formation of new species as well as the extinctions that we're worried about. So, I don't know. What I'm going to tell you is that I think in some cases, at least, as distributions change, so a species may be expanding its range or shrinking its range, it's likely to come into contact with other populations that are very closely related or somewhat remotely related that they might not have had an opportunity to hybridize with in the past. They might not have been in the same place at the same time, so they would not have mated with each other, and then you wouldn't have gotten offspring that were a combination of the two. And that phenomenon could result in a reduction of the number of species, as opposed to everything we've been talking about so far, which is the number of individuals that are birds or number of individuals that live in different habitats. So I think there is, people are predicting that there's room for that. And then there's also room for greater isolation. And so an opportunity for a population or a subset of the individuals to diverge independently of their ancestors or their close relatives in response to the environment. Getting a new species is a high bar. Something like a junco, where they've only been separated for 12 to 15,000 years, and the level of genetic variation means we can identify different subspecies being genetically different in different parts of the country, but they're not that deeply separated that whether or not there's a new species around the, I mean, the AOU could decide tomorrow, the AOS could decide tomorrow that there's more species, but that would not be the same thing as what we're talking about here, so. Okay, you had a question, I think. Did you?
Yes. I think some of the Midwest as a major hub, but also with agriculture, especially for things for crops such as soy and corn. But how can we make a compromise in land use is for juncos and those prairie-based species without compromising in the livelihood that of the farmers themselves, as well as giving more space to them and without
Okay.
pesticide use.
Yes.
And separation.
Okay, so let me try to see if I understood so that I can make sure everybody heard. And this is a very significant question and it's above my pay grade, but I'm going to do my best, okay? Which is when you start saying that grassland birds have been lost because agriculture has taken over the use of that land, and that agriculture is something that people are making a living from and something where we're eating the food. So what kind of compromise is possible when those two things have divergent consequences? Did I understand?
Yes, that is correct. How can we work towards a better land use policy for that?
Yeah.
That compensates farmers at the same time.
Okay, so it's absolutely the critical question. And it is beyond my expertise to try to answer. I'm a bird person, all right? But I'm aware of the critical nature of the question you're asking, so that when I was saying somewhat lightly, what good are birds and why should we care? And saying, well, people will try to make an economic argument that justifies benefits that will come from paying greater attention to the needs of biodiversity in general and birds in specific. So I'm going to ask if there's anybody in the room who feels like they would like to try to address that question of what do we do when human economic needs, oh my God, Jalen's going to give it. You may not, we'll see what she has to say.
I probably cannot speak for all people, so I have more to say than I do, but even currently right now, our government is working on an act called America the Beautiful. And it is just like protect certain lands in order to protect species, protect conservation. And that would be to pay farmers to secure those lands in certain places. So my suggestion would be, as lay people, not politicians in this room, would be to speak to your local politicians and your state politicians, and then your federal representatives to vote for that bill to be passed in our federal government. That we do protect, I think it's 33% of US lands for conservation purposes. So my argument would be to write to your local newspapers and letters to the editor, write to your state. We have the Oregonian, you can write op-eds, and then to talk to your politicians. So the only thing I have to add.
Isn't that lovely? I'm not sure you're going to be satisfied, but I'm very satisfied because youth is the answer, right? And that was from a graduate student saying what she's following, and she knows her biology, and she also knows what's going on with Congress, and also knows how to act if you want to try to change minds. So it was a great statement. Helpful to you? Okay.
I have a question on Zoom, actually.
Oh.
Sam is asking, what is your opinion of Douglas telling Nature's Best Hope idea?
Okay, so the question is, what do I think about Nature's Best Hope, which is the name of a book written by Doug Tallamy, who's an entomologist, I think at the University of Delaware, who's written this book, makes a person hopeful, and his, I was about to say shtick, and I want to be respectful, so that wasn't what I meant to say. Everybody's got a yard. It's not true that everybody's got a yard. Okay, some people don't have yards, but a lot of people have yards. And you can use your land that you have control over in a way that's more welcoming to biodiversity and to life. You can make sure that you're planting native plants rather than invasive species. You can make sure that you've got flowers that are coming out at different times of the season that birds can feed their young to, that you could have young oak trees that even in their tiniest little stage still provide something for the early birds to consume when they first get there and to give to their young. We can do stuff. We can do stuff. And if you don't have a yard or you're not old enough to have a yard yet, then you can, write your congressman the way Jay Lynn was going to. And then when she gets a yard, then she can grow her piece of earth in a way that's more welcoming. So I think it's a brilliant idea. Yeah. I also have tried to put native plants in my yard, and it's harder than I thought it was going to be. So they don't just like go, oh, good, I'm so glad to be here, but I'm working on it. And it's a better yard than it was before I read that book. Yeah.
When I scrub out the bird bath, it seems like they've all been watching
Oh,
so much.
well, for me, the chickadees are the ones that will announce that I've filled the feeder. They go dee 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 dee. And then like maybe the white-breasted nuthatches here, maybe they weren't paying as much attention as the chickadees were. But we cannot underestimate these animals. They're good at what they do. And when they do stuff like that, and you just have to marvel, don't you? And that's why when I read King Solomon's Ring, I thought, I gotta know more. I gotta know more about birds and what they do. But I think you're closing us down, aren't you?
Well, I was just gonna cut us off, but I do want to be respectful of your voice and so forth and people's time here. So why don't we all give a nice round of applause for Ellen?